It's been another week of an impossibly quick churn of events in the Middle East. Crisis of the moment, Syria. And among the most important countries in the mix, Turkey. And yet, we hear so little about Turkey. To fill in the gaps, we turn today to a man who has devoted his professional life to studying and understanding the country of his birth, Turkey. Sinan Ciddi is a Turkish-born academic now residing in the United States. He joins us from Washington, D.C., and we'll be hearing from him in just a few minutes. I caught up with Sinan on Friday for a brief chat on what Turkish President Erdogan may want from a reconstituted Syria. Power and influence, of course, but then some. It has been a confusing few weeks. Just 3 weeks ago marked the beginning of a surge of rebels originating in the north of the country, and in just over a week, they toppled the dynastic Assad regime and took Damascus. Now we know that President Bashar al-Assad deceived his top loyalists to the bitter end. He summoned several for a meeting at his palace, while having already arranged his escape flight to a Russian base on the Syrian coast, and then onward to Moscow. He is reported to have even left his brother behind, and a longtime personal assistant. We have seen the jubilation in the streets of Syrian cities, and the wrenching sorrow of family members turning up at prisons, particularly the infamous Sadnaya complex on the outskirts of Damascus. And they were hoping for a miracle, to find their loved one alive, or at least learn of their fate. 50 years of brutal rule by Bashar al-Assad and his father before him, Hafez, have left a nation riven by decades of internal terror, conflict, and intense devastation, especially since the Syrian civil war began in 2011. The liberating rebels who now control the country are greeted as heroes. The putative leader of this alliance of various rebel groups is Abu Mohammed al Jolani. That is his nom de guerre, and he has quickly dropped that in recent days in favor of his civilian name, Mohammed al-Shara. This image consciousness seems to be part of a well-thought-out strategy to present a more polished and controlled face to the West. It is believed that al-Jolani's family lived on the Golan Heights and were displaced as a result of the Six-Day War in 1967, hence the nom de guerre, al-Jolani, Jolani, Golani. Born in 1982, al-Jolani was reportedly a quiet, bookish type when he went off to Iraq at age 17 to support his Sunni Muslim brothers in conflict. He quickly landed in an American prison and spent 5 years there, during which time he was, apparently, radicalized. From there, he seems to have aligned himself with Jabhat al-Nusra and other extreme jihadist groups. For reasons that are unclear, in 2018 it is believed he formed his own rebel group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is generally referred to now as HTS. And he quickly established himself as a leader. But who exactly is this man? And what are his beliefs? What kind of Syria does he intend to build? Much has been made of his trimmed beard and genial manner. In recent days, he has commented that he does not wish to have a conflict-based relationship with Israel, but rather he's focused on rebuilding and uniting Syria. He has also not demonstrated any urgency to impose Sharia law on the population, although unverified reports of rebels having done so in parts of northern Syria have emerged. And just yesterday, Saturday, al-Jolani stated that he intends to respect the semi-autonomous Kurdish territory in northern Syria. This is especially interesting in light of the fact that the Turkish Air Force has been bombing Kurdish territory heavily since the rebels took power. And there is a strong belief that Turkish President Erdogan is an important supporter of al Jolani's. And Erdogan is extremely hostile to the Kurds in northern Syria. So the pieces of the puzzle do not seem to fit. And those who watch this part of the world, and those who live here as well, are taking a wait-and-see approach, but feeling a little edgy. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and now keeping busy, keeping up with the insane pace of conflict in this part of the world. Stay with us. Friday, December 13th, 6:20 in Israel in the evening, which makes it 11:20 where you are in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Sinan Ciddi, to State of Tel Aviv.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Pleasure. Tell the State of Tel Aviv listeners a bit about yourself. You're new to the program, born in Turkey, so why don't you just sort of give us the very quick biography so that we really understand where all of this wisdom and knowledge that you're going to be sharing comes from.
Thank you. Well, it's a long story, but we can keep it very short for the interest of your listeners and the topic. Yes, I'm Sinan Ciddi. I was born in Turkey a long, long time ago, I think, if the late 70s count. I grew up and was educated in the UK simply because my father, who's a former Air Force pilot turned civilian, decided that he did not want his child to grow up in a country following the 1980 coup where he would have to grow up in a dictatorship. So I spent the better part of my years in the UK, but then I transitioned into the United States, mainly because I got my first academic appointment there, and I've basically stayed here since. So I'm an associate professor of security studies at the Marine Corps University here in Quantico, Virginia, where I teach basically staff officers, majors, the field of security studies as they pursue a master's degree. And I'm also a senior fellow in Turkey at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, FDD, here in Washington, D.C. also. So I split my time relatively equally between the two organizations as I try to make sense of what Turkey's doing in the world and where it seeks to sort of project itself.
And I'm assuming, of course, that you speak fluent Turkish.
I do, yes.
So we're going to really focus on Turkey today. The Western world has been very obsessed for the last week or two with Syria. Under President Erdogan's leadership, the Turkish military has been carpet bombing, in particular the Kurds in northern Syria, and engaging in quite aggressive military and other action in Syria. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, President Erdogan has tutored HTS and its leadership for many years now, since 2017, 2018. Turkey supported, as we know, ISIS. It now supports HTS. And the West isn't really paying careful attention to what Turkey's up to. So with that, let me turn it over to you. And why don't you just start, if you will, why is President Erdogan allying himself and allying his country with HTS, which is listed as a terror organization not only in the United States and the EU, but also by the United Nations. And there's a $10 million bounty on al Jolani's head to this day by the United States. So what's Erdogan up to?
These are all very good questions. And as you presented the sort of scenery as closely as possible, it's a good indication that it is an extremely complex situation. Not to say that anything in the Middle East isn't, but this is particularly complicated as far as what is emerging, and we will just have to see what plays out. But, we can make some distinctions clear, especially why, Erdogan has been in a supportive position of, for want of a better word, terrorists. I mean, HTS is considered a terrorist organization by the United States, the United Nations, the European Union, and Turkey. It's on Turkey's list of terrorist organizations, which is not limited to Al-Qaeda. It is 100% linked to the Islamic State. It is the forerunner. It is the entry of the Islamic State into Syria. That's where HTS's origins lie. And anybody can look this up in terms of the evolution of HTS from the al-Nusra Front to Jabhat al-Nusra to now Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and the relationship that al Jolani maintained both with the leadership of the so-called caliphate of the Islamic State, as well as the leader of al-Qaeda. And these are not tenuous or tangential or distant links. These roots are real. So what we're dealing with, and the West has to really reckon with this, is that we are dealing with an entity which purports or proposes to rule Syria or organize Syria as a state that has direct ties and historical links to the Islamic State and al-Qaeda. And if we're not really certainly aware of this as a people across the world, then we are really shooting ourselves in the foot, because this is dangerous. And the other sort of precedent I just want to lay down there is that all this talk and aspirations and hopes being placed in al Jolani, which honestly I start to find nauseating in the last few days, simply because there is this hope that, well, maybe he's reformed, maybe he's changed, and maybe, you know, he's really going to sort of be pragmatic.
That, of course, is the million-dollar question. Who is Jolani today? Jihadist or moderate pragmatist? In assessing this question, Ciddi looks back to a younger version of Erdogan, who was similar in ways to Jolani. But what we still do not know, and must sit tight to see, is how it all unfolds. For example, how will Jolani treat minorities? Will he establish leadership legitimacy and maintain control among the various rebel factions? And of course, how will HTS manage Turkey and Erdogan? Now, back to Sinan Ciddi.
And I can't help but think, this is exactly what pundits in Turkey said about Erdogan back in 2000, 2001, because he went to jail, he came out of jail, and, you know, suddenly he had an epiphany, a revelation that his Islamist worldview was no longer valid, that he'd changed, he'd grown up, he'd read some books in jail, which I very much doubt. And suddenly he embraced democracy, secularism, Turkey's position in the West, and this notion of the fact that he had changed took over the sort of airwaves, and he was a darling of the West, and President Obama referred to him as a model leader, and Turkey as the model country that the Muslim world should aspire to, until about 2013, when we all started wondering what changed Erdogan. Why is he becoming an authoritarian, subsequently an autocratic leader? And my answer has always been the same. He has not changed. He's just gone back to his roots, right? This was all somehow a ploy. You know, he said, he referred to democracy as a train that we get off when we, you know, reach our stop and basically go back to business, which is a longer way of saying, look, you can't take the Islamist out of Erdogan, and I don't think you can take the jihadist out of al Jolani. I mean, again, the Islamic State and al-Qaeda, these are head cutters. We have fought two major campaigns in the West against Salafist jihadism in the world. You know, not that we've succeeded much, but if we're going to place hopes in this entity or entities like this in trying to stabilize Syria, I'm sorry, we are playing with fire and, you know, really sort of burying our head in the sand. For Erdogan, look, he's been interested in deposing the Assad regime, going back to the origins of the civil war. He's bitter at the fact that the United States has not really joined him in that. He's bitter that the United States has worked with the Kurdish elements to really undermine the Islamic State threat. And he has used a variety of Salafi jihadist entities in Syria, as you also mentioned, including Jolani's outfit, HTS, and groomed them and backed them and financially given them resources, as well as what we assume to be a heavy dose of weapons to carry out their sort of mission to topple the regime for years now.
This is worth a pause to digest the fact that, according to Ciddi, Erdogan has supported HTS and al Jolani with arms, training, and all manner of support since 2018. This, of course, has been critical to the HTS success in taking control of Syria. It is also remarkable that Turkey, an important NATO ally and country, has been openly arming jihadist rebels.
Nobody's told Erdogan as a NATO country, you cannot do that, right? This is contrary to our values. This is contrary to our security interests. And also, at some point in the future, the more you get embedded with these organizations, that you back them, you may not be in a position to rein them in the subsequent future. Now, we've heard all these reports such that Turkey is now emboldened. It is strengthened in the Middle East to the detriment of Iran, Russia. Erdogan strengthened his hand. I think Erdogan has caught everybody unaware. Turkey is assumed to be the country which greenlit this uprising by the so-called rebels. And so this is where we're all starting. So the reason why Erdogan did this is because Erdogan's primary mission is to basically topple Assad for years now and to hopefully install a Sunni-friendly regime that he has a great deal of influence over, but also, ensure that state is friendly to Turkey's interests.
So, one of the things that you've mentioned that's really interesting and that's been coming up quite a bit is the West kind of wanting to see this al Jolani as you put it, maybe he's really kind of matured into something different. And it's fascinating. I don't know if you saw this, but the initial broadcast from Syrian Broadcasting Center on Saturday when the rebels took over was a gentleman dressed in a sort of like hybrid kind of military. There was like a tan khaki kind of thing, no beard, clean shaven, spoke in a very kind of measured newscaster way, not the kind of crazy stuff we're accustomed to seeing from either ISIS or the Taliban with, all these guys kind of with turbans and guns and yelling and screaming. No, he was very Western, delivered a very calm message, and we're here to liberate and to restore, dignity and order and all that. And al Jolani has clearly been tutored with respect to how to present to the West and just kind of calm their nerves. Now, later in the evening, the jihadis with the guns did sort of, find their way into the TV studio and did what we would expect to see, but I don't think that was as widely circulated. But, Jolani's beard is trimmed. He's not yelling. He's saying really nice things like, yes, I'd love to see the international community come into Syria and help us deal with chemical weapons. I mean, that's kind of a nice thing to hear from a jihadist, right? The question, I suppose, is whether he's serious or not, and how serious he is. And not only that, the degree to which this man and his group can actually take control and operate a civil society. I mean, as I'm sure you're aware, I'm aware, there's already a lot of talk about settling scores.
I would say a couple of things. The first, to your earlier point about HTS wishing to sort of like control and putting out the right messages. There's one thing about rhetoric and there's another thing about action. And I hope what Jolani is saying is brought to fruition. But let's be clear, what we are desiring and expecting of Jolani and his administration of Syria is what we in the West interpret to be a Weberian understanding of how a state should be governed, as in a bureaucratic, rational sort of entity that is governed, it's representative, it has legitimacy, it has buy-in. And that only works if you have a competent government that's sincere, that wishes to uphold the national interests of all of its citizens, not subjects or slaves, right? They've already put out also messages saying that they're interested in Sharia law and that they would be willing to implement that. And the other thing that you're not supposed to do is obviously sort of use your element of power to essentially go after people you don't like or minorities or people that you have a beef with. And what I would say is like, without the acquiescence and acceptance of all of its citizen bodies and interest groups, such as the Kurds, the Alawites, what you name it, right? The Druze, the Christians, you're not going to have a stable Syria. And that's just a fact. That's not a speculation on our part. That's a fact. We cannot have a stable Syria, even if it is autocratically or, imposed upon for a short period of time. People then start fighting. So let's be clear about expectations, rhetoric versus actions. We will have to see what plays out. And I think to the extent that Jolani is putting out the right rhetoric but doesn't follow up with it, he's probably betting on the fact that the West, whether it's the European Union, the United States, NATO, no one is essentially going to care about that as long as they don't, present waves of refugees that threatens the borders of Europe or a counterinsurgency or a terrorist threat to the West or the region in general and threatens allies like Israel or Iraq or whatever. So that's what I'm guessing he's betting on.
But let's go back again to Erdogan, because yes, it is complex, isn't it? Among other things, he has clearly instructed his military to bombard the Kurds. They're getting hit hard from the air. There are, I believe, 23 million Kurds who live in this incredibly volatile, troubled, mountainous area
bordered by like Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon. And they don't have a country, and they very much want one. And Erdogan very much does not want them to have one. What's his beef with the Kurds?
Yeah, so lots going on here. Now, as far as Erdogan's concerned, he's coming at this from a very insincere and arrogant position. And I say that not lightly, because if you take a step back and just look at the goal that he has and trying to determine who gets to live where and under what conditions in northern Syria, specifically the Kurdish population of Syria, Erdogan is interested in population engineering, as in he does not want an autonomous zone, which Syria has had. And what Erdogan wants to do is essentially return waves of refugees that Turkey has taken in since the beginning of the Syrian civil war, somewhere between 3 to 4 million Syrian refugees, and sort of plant them in parts of northern Syria along the Turkish border, such that it dilutes the Kurdish sort of population majority in some of these cities and towns, such as Kamushli, Kobani, and many others, right? And simply because that's based on this narrative that he will not countenance or, tolerate the existence of what he has called, quote, terroristan, as in something that is ruled by the Kurdish autonomous region. There's no denying that. But unlike sort of jihadists and Erdogan-type Islamists inside of Turkey, who have sort of, always purported to have changed, the Syrian Kurds have never threatened Turkey. They don't, want to threaten Turkey. They have no beef with Turkey. What they want is two things. One is to survive, in Syria as a people and live their own way of life. So they have to reach an accommodation with whoever governs that. But the other thing they want is also they don't want to be butchered by jihadists such as ISIS or remnants thereof. Salih Muslim, the leader of the PYD, has always said, look, I have no beef with Turkey. I have no ill will towards Turkey. And in fact, before 2012, Salih Muslim was quite a person who was welcome in Ankara. Erdogan dealt with him numerous times. The reason why Erdogan declared the PYD-YPG as a terrorist threat is because when Erdogan decided to overthrow Assad, he gave Salih Muslim an ultimatum saying, unless you join with me and declare Assad to be a terrorist, and that you join me to overthrow him, I will declare you a terrorist.
This is quite remarkable that Erdogan told the senior Kurdish leader, Salih Muslim, in 2013, that either he declares Assad a terrorist, or if he refused to do so, that Erdogan would declare Salih Muslim to be a terrorist. And that is exactly what happened.
Muslim said that's not something he could do because you can understand this. Muslim has to live in Syria. His sons have died fighting against Daesh. And the day after that, Erdogan declared Salih Muslim and the PYD a terrorist organization. And the reason why Erdogan keeps, harping on this notion that, the SDF or PYD, YPG is a threat to Turkey is that gets him votes at home. I'm sorry, that it is as simple as that. People don't say this enough who study Turkey. The PYD, YPG is not a physical, existential, or security threat to Turkey. They have zero beef with Turkey. Erdogan knows this, but to the extent that he can keep alive this threat and say, we will not countenance the creation of another Kurdish state. Well, if he thought that, then why did he reach an accommodation with the Iraqi Kurds, which Turkey now has diplomatic representation in, strong business ties, frequently, has a high-level dialogue with the Barzanis and the Talibanis. A few decades ago, Turkey considered that to be an unstable element on Turkey's southern border, right? This is all internal politics. And to the extent that Erdogan decides to sort of, continue bombarding Kurds for his political benefit, also adds to the continued instability which Syria, I think, will continue to experience. Because like I said before, unless you get the Kurdish leadership on board with whatever settlement is reached in Syria, then you're not going to have a stable Syria. And the extent to which Erdogan thinks he has a right to determine where Kurds live, what territories they live, how they are politically organized inside of Syria, he's an external power. What right does Turkey have to say, this is how you shall live in your own country? It's just unbelievably arrogant.
All politics are local. That's the old cliche, and it's a cliche for a region.
Correct.
And so Erdogan, of course, is playing to his local constituencies and presenting the Syrian Kurds as some kind of threat to the Turkish nation. But what about the West? The West is quiet. Turkey is a NATO ally. He's in there bombing the crap out of the Kurds, as you say, rather sort of, duplicitous with respect to his allegiances and how he perceives and presents the Kurds and treats them. The West just isn't paying attention, isn't understanding what's going on here.
So that's a really good question. So I'm going to try and be as balanced as possible. So the kind thing I will say about the West right now, on the one hand is, look, let's reimagine ourselves following the invasion of Iraq and the fallout from that. We got rid of a brutal dictator, Saddam Hussein, and we did pronounce sort of, victory and freedom has come to the Arab Iraqi state, and people were going to love democracy and freedom, and we just got it really badly wrong. And obviously, we're still licking our wounds and paying the price of that. So to the extent that we're celebrating the fall of Assad and trying to figure out, well, do we take HTS off the terrorists? What do we do? I mean, this is just an impossible problem for the West in general to deal with. They don't want to antagonize the guy. They probably don't trust him as far as they can throw him on the other. Europe is worried about floods of refugees, but they also want to send them back from Europe to the extent they can to Syria, right? So on the one hand, they don't really know what to do with this. On the less kinder side, Secretary of State Blinken visited Ankara. He was in Ankara meeting with Prime Minister Fidan. There isn't a US flag in sight when the secretary is sitting down with Fidan in the room. He's not even at the foreign ministry. They're meeting in some sort of office block, I think off the airport or some such place, right? It is really a sort of rebuff towards the US Secretary of State. There are two Turkish flags sitting in the back of the ground, and they've met in this sort of really low-key area. And I'm not saying that they have to pull out the red carpet or whatever, but you are meeting with the Secretary of State of a treaty ally, and this is Turkey's way of sort of snubbing the West. And this is just a sort of, foray into what I would think is, the United States obviously is in a transition period between one administration to another. But on the less kinder side of this is, it seems to me that most officials in the Biden administration are looking for jobs on LinkedIn rather than essentially looking at, taking ownership. Nobody wants to take ownership and essentially determine how we should, behave towards what's going on. And whilst I admit that it's hard to actually, for the United States to put a thumb on the situation and declare a policy, which the next one will essentially have to inherit, I get that, but you're still in office until, January 20th. And if people ask you, well, what can the United States do? Well, the one thing that we can do as our partners on the ground, the SDF, the Kurdish sort of entity that we have backed and organized and worked with, is we say hands off. We draw a red line in the sand and say essentially, hands off these people. These are off limits. We're not asking to commit U.S. troops to any combat mission. We're not asking Americans to essentially sort of, muster up their rifles and take positions against any SNA rebels or whatever. But what we do is we basically say to every actor that has malign intent towards the SDF, back off, right? We protect them. I'd be very surprised if the Turks were emboldened to carry out bombing raids against SDF if the United States was essentially had their sort of back, right? Because this is one bridge that we don't want to burn in the West. This is unforgivable. Not only because have they essentially been the front line of our degradation and elimination of the Islamic State threat, but for decades on, and they are the only entity in a vast sort of geography which has all different shades of militant Islamist jihadism. These are the only forces that we can depend upon, who have our back, that we can work with, who are motivated. They should have an interest in essentially maintaining stability in the region, and we don't burn them. I don't for a minute pretend that the negotiations of what takes place in Syria subsequently, in terms of what kind of political solution is drafted, tabled, and discussed, is a gargantuanly difficult task. But at least the United States can say, for the moment, back off these people. We have their backs. You do not target them. You don't bomb them. And unfortunately, we've dropped the ball on this. We're not willing to do this in the West.
This moment, the lame duck period, as the Biden administration winds down and Trump 2.0 gears up, is also a time when many actors in the Middle East see tremendous opportunity to take care of business that will be much tougher to do after January 20th. The Biden administration is clearly not going out on any limbs on behalf of the Kurds. And so far, President-elect Trump has been silent on this escalating situation. And President Erdogan is filling the vacuum. Another minor detail that seems to be getting lost in the frantic pace of events is that it is the Kurds in northern Syria who maintain and control the prisons where former ISIS members are detained. Sprawling, primitive, miserable tent cities where extremism is rampant. The West has long preferred to pretend that this issue doesn't exist, but it may soon be forced upon the world in a very dramatic manner.
And let me ask about a quite significant point that seems to be kind of getting lost in all of this noise, and that is the issue of the prisons that contain tens of thousands of former ISIS members in northern Syria that are operated and administered by the Kurds. The West has really just totally abandoned its responsibility to help the Kurds in that endeavor. And they've been administering these prisons now, since, 2018, 2017? And there is a concern that if and as Turkey continues to attack and pummel the Kurds, that there will be, a breakout from these prisons, that all of these former ISIS fighters and families, many of whom have only become more radicalized while they've been cooped up in these hellholes in the desert, that they'll be free.
They've been saying this for years, to the extent that Turkey is permitted or unrestrained in terms of carrying out strikes against the SDF. We can't do two things at the same time. Turkey has air supremacy, it has air power, it has heavy artillery, it has a lot of heavy big guns, and it's on Turkey. The SDF cannot even fully address that, but they have to clearly ensure that the safety of their people and their sort of towns and cities as well as their civilians first, right? So those prisons right now are unfortunately don't have the protection and coverage of what we've relied upon for years, which is SDF sort of manning of. And if they break out, yes, we will have another Islamic State problem, presumably, right? And why are we turning a blind eye to this in the West? Well, I think there is this sort of relative amount of idiocy, and I really say this, as carefully as I can, especially in the Washington circles, right? Because there is this what I consider to be, an idiotic belief that Turkey's actions in essentially in Syria right now, we should turn a blind eye to the SDF and what they're doing to that, because ultimately Turkey, the United States, and Israel are on the same page of having weakened the Russians and the Iranians, and we should focus on that. And I see where that sort of logic is coming from, but I also think it's slightly insincere, because the Turks and the Israelis are not on the same page. If Turkey's not interested in, and that was one of the speculations, as in, did Turkey just surreptitiously or clandestinely sort of, in concert with Israel and the United States, sort of greenlight this uprising against Assad to weaken Russia and Iran? In my wildest dreams, I don't think that's how Erdogan works, but okay. But the problem is this, if the United States does not essentially maintain its backing of the SDF forces and allows this sort of what essentially is going to be this massive firefight that I assume is going to break out between the SDF Turkish forces that will also draw in Turkish regular military in addition to the Syrian National Army, which is fighting against the SDF, then how does that result in stability? How does that allow the West to capitalize upon Russian and Iranian weakness, strategic weakness in this moment? I simply fail to understand how that comes to pass, right? It doesn't make sense to me. And as a result, I think what we're doing is putting the cart before the horse. We can continue to capitalize in this moment in the weakness against, Russia's inability to protect its regime, the fact that it may not be able to protect its airbase, its naval ports, its naval assets in the Mediterranean, Iran's sort of, implosion and the loss of Syria and its land bridge to Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? We can capitalize upon that, but not by abandoning the SDF and also not investing in the primary stability of Syria, which is probably the Kurdish contingent. And the reason why I say that is, if anybody asks us what is the most stable element of Iraq right now, it's the KRG, right? I have zero faith in HTS, SNA, or any of the myriad of jihadist organizations in being able to control, implement a Bavarian understanding of a unified Syria. But I have a wholehearted, belief in Syrian Kurds' ability to self-govern, but also project a model of governance that the rest of Syrian Arab state could actually essentially emulate. Not that they'll be given the chance to do so, but I think an investment in the Syrian Kurds is a better investment, a safer bet than anything else. And not just for today, but future generations of when the United States, NATO, or the West will have to be involved once or, one reason or another in the Middle East again. There are partners in name and allies in fact, and we should recognize that and stand by it. We are only as strong as our allies. We love to say that in NATO. We love to say that in the West. But from where I sit, I just see us giving up on them.
I share your pessimism. And I think that between now and January 21st, there's going to be a lot of chaos that is going to take root. I don't think we're going to have the happy, orderly coming together, kumbaya of rebels that we would all prefer to see. This moment in time represents so many opportunities for so many interests in the region and also superpowers. And I guess the question is, it's interesting how you comment on the rather dowdy reception that Secretary Blinken received when he stopped off in Turkey the other day. And yes, I did see those photos. We all saw that slap down of Secretary Blinken. What's less clear is if and how the Trump effect will kind of be felt or imposed with respect to Erdogan in the coming weeks and months. Of course, Trump famously thought they were big pals last time he was in office, as you'll recall, but someone's going to have to sit him down and educate him, Turkey 2.0 for Trump 2.0, because he's going to have to be a little more disciplined, focused, and serious this time.
Correct. And I share your sentiments. I mean, we'll have to see. I have zero predictive ability as to what it's going to look like for Turkey and the administration here. If the United States ever did that to Turkey, that diplomatic faux pas, we'd never hear the end of it. It is discourteous, and they did it purposefully, knowing full well that the US wouldn't care, or they just wouldn't kick up a big stink. And that just says more about Turkey than it does about America. But you're right. I'm also wildly pessimistic at the outcome of this, and not because I'm a downer, but because pretending that it's going to be anything else is fantasy. I mean, not because I think we have it right or our pessimism is warranted. We'll have to see what goes on. But if you just look at the scene and what is supposed to essentially stabilize Syria into a wonderful democracy, and this is not something I also want to downplay the optimism and the euphoria of Syrians who feel, a breath of fresh air after overthrowing a horrific governance structure. Right, as you correctly pointed to, they should celebrate. But just saying that, it doesn't make the fact that, jihadists in a position of power is not what we want in terms of, who we want in terms of, settling scores and essentially, putting the best foot forward in terms of democratic governance. It's just not a function of reality, as I like to say. And so I think you're right. I think we're in for, a pronounced period of instability. It's certainly up until January 20th. But even going forward, I just fear that this is going to be a next sort of flashpoint and possibly a zone of conflict, which the new Trump administration may not be able to avoid involvement in. They were lucky in their first administration, but this time they may not be so lucky.
Yeah, I think that's a foregone conclusion. So thank you so much, Sinan Ciddi, for being so generous with your time, insights, knowledge. You are now officially anointed the State of Tel Aviv Turkey expert. How does it feel?
Well, I didn't expect that this morning while driving to Quantico, but okay. Thank you so much. I appreciated the time and the opportunity to speak to you, over listeners, and yourself.
It was really fascinating, and I'm sure we'll be turning back to you. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Look forward to it.
And that's a wrap on Turkey for Today. Please rate us online. Check us out at State of Tel Aviv on Instagram, or at State of TLV on X. And for those of you out there enjoying our hardworking podcasts, if you have not done so already, please consider supporting us by taking out a paid subscription to State of Tel Aviv. It would not only put a spring in our step, but will support our work. I hate having to ask every week, but when I do, there are always people who step up. Please be one of them this time. Thanks for being here. Have a great week. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.